My name's Nir. I'm the director of the Applied Ethics Center here at UMass Boston. And this is our last talk for the semester in our Artificial Intelligence and Experience series. Our guest today is Professor Susan Schneider from the University of Connecticut. Susan will be talking about engineering the mind, the scope and the limits of radical brain enhancements. A few words about Susan's bio. Susan is a philosopher and cognitive scientist. She's a distinguished scholar at the U.S. Library of Congress, a professor at the University of Connecticut, a faculty member in the Ethics and Technology group at Yale, and a visiting member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. She's also a recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award, and she writes about the fundamental nature of the self and mind, especially from the vantage point of issues in philosophy of mind, metaphysics, cognitive science, applied ethics, astrobiology, and AI. She's written about the mind-body problem, space-time emergence, superintelligent AI, the nature of life, the mathematical nature of physics, whether the mind is a program, and the nature of the person. Discussions of her work have appeared in the New York Times, Wired, Science, Big Think, Nautilus, Smithsonian, Discover, PBS, and many other places. And if I continue, she will not have time for her talk. So, Susan, without much further ado, thank you for coming, and take it away.
Oh, thank you for having me. Let me turn on the mic. Testing. Hello? Oh, I have such a loud voice anyway. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go straight in. I'm going to talk about radical brain enhancement. Merging with AI has been all over the news. So what I want to do is encourage a little bit of metaphysical sobriety, if you will. Ooh, that sounds scary. So the evolution of the brain was constrained by environmental and metabolic demands, right? But AI-based brain enhancement technologies have opened up a vast design space, offering new ways to explore the space at a rate much faster than biological evolution. In a new book that I just handed in a few days ago called Future Minds, I had to think about the title, I call this mind design. It's a type of intelligent design, if you will, but we humans, not some god, will be the designers, right? So we will be engaging in intelligent design if we're creating artificial minds. I find that humbling because we're not terribly evolved, frankly. As the alien superintelligence put it in the Carl Sagan film Contact, you're an interesting species, an interesting mix. You are capable of such beautiful dreams and such horrible nightmares. We harness the power of the atom, but all around us, people are starving and racism abounds. So we have a lot to work on as a species. Mind design doesn't just involve the creation of supercomputers and robots. Mind design involves tinkering with the human mind itself. Sorry. So maybe this will get to your concern. The historian Michael Bess raises what he calls the Jetsons Fallacy. I don't know how many of you remember the Jetsons, but think about Star Wars, for example. I mean, in some science fiction, but not all science fiction, what we see are all these sophisticated androids walking about, right, or humanoids of other sorts. And the humans themselves are unaltered by the AI technology. That's a fallacy, according to Bess, because in reality, as AI gets sophisticated and creates intelligences, it will also impact the human brain. So we will be enhanced by AI technology as well, to the extent that we find that desirable. Right now, there are a lot of projects working on that. So if you go to DARPA's webpage, you could learn all about closed-loop neural implants designed to help people with illnesses like post-traumatic stress disorder. You can also look at the fascinating work by Theodore Berger, not with DARPA, at a university, who's working on the artificial hippocampus, which is right now in clinical trials involving humans, having been successfully tested in primates. So this is amazing technology bringing artificial intelligence into the head. And in that vein, Elon Musk recently founded a new company called Neuralink. And there's also another large company called Kernel, designed not just to create neural prosthetics or therapies, but to eventually enhance the human brain and make us smarter and more efficient. So this is mind design. It's not just creating artificial intelligences. It is impacting us and maybe even merging us with artificial intelligence. So evolution did the first wave of mind creation. Businesses like Amazon and Facebook might be doing the second wave. I find that scary. I mean, think about what just happened with the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal. Do you really want corporations like Google and Facebook altering the shape of the human mind? So all stakeholders need to be involved, and that's why it's neat to learn about the Experience Project here at UMass Boston. In the book, I talk about what I call perverse realizations of AI technology. Here are some. They are situations in which artificial intelligence leads to human suffering or to the suffering or demise of other conscious beings. The types that I discuss in the book are not the usual types of perverse realizations that you see in the existing literature. I look at overlooked situations involving the creation of conscious machines. And secondly, I look at scenarios that concern the use of radical brain enhancements. So this mind-machine merger, you might have seen that in the news being discussed by individuals like Elon Musk, who seems to be interviewed by reporters a lot. And he suggests that we need to merge with AI as a means to avoid being outmoded by artificial intelligence that will be replacing us in the workplace over the next 30 years, and as a way to keep abreast of superintelligent AI. So Musk, like many others, has been concerned about the rise of machines that may eventually be smarter than us and how we would ever control them. So Musk's answer is that we merge with machines ourselves. So Neural Lace is one of the products he's developing right now at his company to merge humans with machines. But that enhancement, as well as other AI-based enhancements, are supposed to allow data from your brain to travel wirelessly to one's digital devices or the cloud, where unlimited computing power becomes available. Okay, so this is background. What I want to do today is I want to look at some problems with the idea of a mind-machine merger. I think that we can't just let business leaders decide the future of the mind. We need to think about these issues from the vantage point of different academic disciplines. And as a philosopher, I have some concerns. First off, radical enhancements like brain uploading, which I'll talk about later, or replacing parts of the brain with microchips are, first off, infeasible if the AI components do not support consciousness. And AI consciousness whether AI can in fact be conscious is actually not at all clear. And I'll talk about this in a few days, Saturday morning at the Harvard AI conference. Second, it may not even be compatible with the persistence of the self or person to enhance your brain in radical ways. And this will be something I develop today. Okay, so what I need to do to discuss these issues is talk about the nature of consciousness a bit. And let me just check in. How many people here have heard of the hard problem of consciousness? Okay, good. So I'm just going to go quick then. So when you see the rich hues of a sunset or smell the aroma of your morning espresso shot, you're having conscious experience. It feels like something to be you. Consciousness is what makes life wonderful at some points and awful at others, right? So conscious experience is, of course, a big issue philosophically. We don't know the nature of consciousness, but what I talk about today is really just the issue of whether machines could ever feel, whether it could feel like something to be them. Okay, so we're just going to leave the notion of consciousness intuitive, and I'm not going to go into the hard problem. I don't need to. Richard Dawkins recently said that it's not obvious to me that a replacement of our species by our own technological creations would necessarily be a bad thing. That's very suggestive. Well, my response is, first of all, notice that if non-conscious machines supplant biological intelligences, the singularity would be a complete nightmare because it would be the end of consciousness on Earth. Right? So machine consciousness is actually extremely important to how the singularity plays out. That is, to how the radical development of artificial intelligence technology ends up promoting human flourishing. In my work with NASA, which I talk about in the book Future Minds, I urge that, in fact, other planets may be going through similar phenomena. If that's true, the issue of machine consciousness takes on a cosmic import, speaking to the issue of the evolution of intelligence throughout the universe. It may be that, sadly, consciousness is a momentary flowering of experience that is a small blip in a larger timeline that ends with non-conscious AI. Sobering. Further, more reasons to be skeptical of Dawkins' openness on the issue. What if we slowly merge with machines as people like Ray Kurzweil and Elon Musk propose? Well, if AI can't be conscious, then merging with machines would be a terrible idea. If microchips are the wrong stuff for conscious experience, then a mind-machine merger will not happen, or if it does, there would be a loss of conscious experience. Consider working memory and attention. These are core aspects of human cognition, and they have bottlenecks. They're super slow. They're also closely related to work right now on the neural basis of consciousness. There's, for example, the global workspace theory of consciousness, which implicates the processing involving working memory and attention being the neural basis of conscious experience. If AI doesn't support consciousness, if we can't replace those parts of the brain with neural prosthetics, I think the idea of a mind-machine merger is bunk. We wouldn't be able to even process material piped in through AI at the sensory periphery. Say you get a mobile internet connection through part of the brain that is not involving memory and attention, because you would have these massive attentional bottlenecks. You wouldn't be able to process high bandwidth, ultra sophisticated waves of information. So consciousness, that question, actually bears on the feasibility of the mind-machine merger. Okay, now this being said, for the rest of the talk today, let's suppose that AI can underlie conscious experience in the, that is to say, when a neural prosthetic goes into parts of the brain that underlie conscious experience, you don't lose consciousness. And let's suppose, furthermore, that artificial intelligent beings, some of them can actually be conscious. Okay, so I'm going to make this presupposition for the rest of the talk, and I'm going to lift that in the talk at Harvard in a few days, where I'm going to urge that the issue is very, very tricky. But for now, let's suppose that microchips are the right stuff for conscious experience. There are further problems with this idea of a mind-machine merger that I want to go into today. A thought experiment. Suppose it's 2035 and you're a technophile, so you decide to add a mobile internet connection to your retina. A year later, you enhance your working memory by adding neural circuitry. You are now a cyborg. Now skip ahead to 2045. Well, through nanotechnological therapies and enhancements, you're able to extend your life. And as the years progress, you continue to accumulate more far-reaching enhancements. By 2060, after several small but cumulatively profound alterations, you are a post-human being. Post-humans are future beings who are no longer unambiguously human, for they have mental capacities that radically exceed those of present-day humans. Now suppose it's 2300 AD, and the slow addition of better and better AI components has left no real intellectual difference in kind between you and a superintelligent AI. A superintelligent AI, by the way, is an artificial intelligence that is by definition smarter than humans in every respect. Mathematical reasoning, social intelligence, and more. You are now almost entirely engineered by AI technology. You are perhaps more aptly characterized as being a member of a rather heterogeneous class of AI life forms. You have now merged with AI. Well, what I want to ask is, should you enhance? Would it truly be you? So what I want to do now is introduce some classic issues in philosophy. But first, I want to give my opponent a name and characterize their position. A nice name. So the thought experiment features the kind of enhancements that transhumanists and certain well-known tech leaders like Elon Musk and Ray Kurzweil aspire to. So transhumanists aim to redesign the human condition, striving for immortality and synthetic intelligence, all in hopes of improving their overall way of life. I am a transhumanist. I've been one since college, when I was an extropian. I think that's what it was called. And Jay here is one of the founders of transhumanism. So it's great to have him in the audience. But I worry about execution. Okay? So here's the plan that many transhumanists have. And it goes back to the thought experiment. You start with the unenhanced human, all of us. Embark upon significant upgrading with cognitive and physical enhancements, becoming what we called a post-human, and then graduating to superintelligence, and probably doing that by uploading, moving all of your mental processing to the cloud, right? Okay, I call this type of trajectory for immortality and intelligence fusion optimism, because the idea is that it's optimist about merging with machines. Now, my question, should you enhance in these radical ways? I mean, who wouldn't like longevity and to be smarter, more efficient? I mean, hey, I would just like to be able to remember people's names and faces, right? I mean, just imagine getting enhancements here and there. You know, it's sort of like when you go to the doctor, you get a vaccination or whatever. Well, now, you know, you decide, you know, I'm really, really sick of not remembering my students' names, right? Or I really would love it if I could get an enhancement that made me want to grade papers. So I'll just go, I'll pay somebody, and then walk out, and boom, I have the enhancement. What's wrong with that? Well, I hate to be a naysayer, especially when it comes to something as desirable as wanting to grade papers, right? But in order to understand whether you should enhance, we need to first ask what we are. So this goes to the field of metaphysics. I am a metaphysician. I think about the fundamental nature of reality. And one of the things we think about in that field is the question, what is it to be a self or a person? What is it to be you? Would you continue to exist if you enhanced in radical ways sketched in that thought experiment? Or would you have been replaced by someone or something else? To understand what I'm getting at, consider the metaphysics of everyday objects. Consider an espresso machine in your favorite cafe. Someone turns it on, they make you a coffee. Now you can't imagine after watching that process that you would worry that the machine is no longer the same coffee machine that it was 2 minutes ago, even though a few things have changed. Like, maybe now there's some espresso sitting in the machine that wasn't there before. Because you know that nothing key to the espresso machine has changed. Nobody came out and, vaporized it or dismantled it completely, breaking all of its parts. Some features of a thing turn out to be essential to the identity of the thing, while other features of a thing are not. Similarly, some features of you are essential to your survival and others are not. So your hair color, how much hair you have, none of these things are essential features of you, how much you weigh. But other features are essential to the survival of the person. And the field of personal identity asks, what features are essential? And of course, there are some classic answers here, which I'll get to in a second. But the main point, which I want to hammer home, is the following. If enhancement brings goodies like superhuman intelligence and radical life extension, it had better not involve the elimination of any of your essential properties. For in that case, the smarter mind or fitter body would be experienced by someone else, not you. So the merger that Musk and Kurzweil talk about wouldn't be possible. It would essentially be a form of suicide for whoever embarked upon the path to enhancement. Okay, what are your essential properties? Consider yourself in first grade and notice that you probably have very few of those molecules, right, that made you up then, now. You've changed completely. And your psychology has changed as well. So what is it that remains the same? It's a very difficult question. If you're simply the physical stuff that made up your brain and body in first grade, you would have ceased to exist a long time ago. That physical first grader is not here any longer. Ray Kurzweil clearly appreciates the issue in his books. In The Singularity is Near, he comments, so who am I? Since I am constantly changing, am I just a pattern? What if someone copies the pattern? Am I the original or the copy? Perhaps I am this stuff here. That is, the both ordered and chaotic collection of molecules that make up my body and brain. In that passage, Kurzweil is alluding to two distinct types of theories that are classic theories in the personal identity literature. The first is the well-known continuity theory, the psychological continuity theory. You are essentially your memories and your ability to reflect on yourself, it says. And in its most general form, you are your overall psychological configuration, what Kurzweil referred to as your pattern. There are a lot of different variants of this view, but that's the essential element of the view. There's also what I call brain-based materialism. This says you are essentially the material that you're made out of, your body and your brain. What Kurzweil refers to as the ordered and chaotic collection of molecules that make up the body and the brain. Okay? So those are two views. But of course, there is also the classic soul theory that says that your essence is your soul or mind, understood as a non-physical entity distinct from your body. So in that case, the soul survives the death of the brain. There's also a view which I quite like, which is called the no-self view. And this is the view that isn't really a theory of personal identity at all. In fact, what it says is the self is an illusion. The I is a grammatical fiction, as Friedrich Nietzsche once pointed out. There are bundles of impressions, but there's no underlying self. That was Hume's view. There's no survival because there's no person. And that's the classic Buddhist position. And I believe, Jay, that's your position as well.
Parfit too.
Yes. Oh, yes, of course. How could I not bring up Parfit? I was thinking of him. Philosophers become, right now, contemporary philosophers who do metaphysics are very sympathetic to this view because of the influential work of Derek Parfit, which I'll be talking about a little later. So, bearing in mind these classic positions, let's go back to the question of whether you should merge with AI. Should you enhance and embark upon that path? Well, each of these views has its own implications about whether you should enhance or not. For example, the continuity view holds that your overall psychological configuration needs to be preserved. So your essential property in that case is that there'll be a psychological continuity relation that holds between your earlier self and your future self. This view seems friendly to the idea of merging with AI, at least at first pass, okay? Because you could move beyond your substrate and be made up of microchips if psychological continuity is preserved. However, I have worries about whether continuity would really be preserved that I'll raise soon. Brain-based materialism doesn't allow you to change substrates. So if you buy into the idea that you are essentially your brain and your body, then you can't merge with AI, because then you would be essentially made up of some radically different substrate. The soul theory, it's actually unclear what the soul theory would say. I mean, there's so many different religions, and I wouldn't purport to make claims about whether the soul persists or not. But the question here is whether these enhancements would be compatible with the persistence of the soul. Perhaps on some views, they will be. I mean, perhaps people who are Catholic will have to ask the Pope whether they should have enhancements. The no-self view. Well, on this view, you can strive to enhance. For instance, you might find intrinsic value in adding more superintelligence to the universe. You might value life forms with higher forms of consciousness and wish that your successor be such a creature. So the point here is that there's no survival at all. So if you embark upon a path to enhancement, you're deciding what life you would want for these future fleeting instances of consciousness, if you will. You won't be deciding about whether you would survive, because there's no survival and there's no person. This is tricky. It's a tricky view, but maybe it's right. Okay, all this being said, let's go back to Kurzweil's view, which he identified as patternism in his books. Nick Bostrom, a leading transhumanist, as well as Ray Kurzweil and many other transhumanists, adopt a novel and intriguing version of the psychological continuity view, which is called patternism. Kurzweil writes, the specific set of particles that my body and brain comprise are in fact completely different from the atoms and molecules that I comprised only a short while ago. We know that most of our cells are turned over in a matter of weeks, and even our neurons, which persist as distinct cells for a relatively long time, nonetheless change all of their constituent molecules within a month. I am rather like the pattern that water makes in a stream as it rushes past the rocks in its path. The actual molecules of water change every millisecond, but the pattern persists for hours or even years. That's a deep passage. And that's his articulation of patternism. And you can appreciate that it's a version of the continuity view. Put in the language of cognitive science, which the transhumanists surely would do, it says what is essential to you is your computational configuration. The sensory subsystems and systems that your brain has, like early vision, the association areas of the brain that integrate the basic sensory subsystems, the neural circuitry making up your general purpose reasoning, your attentional system, your memories, and so on. Together, all this forms the algorithm that we could say your brain computes, if you will. That's a sort of modern-day articulation of the continuity view. Well, what's wrong with this view? Because if Kurzweil's saying that we could survive enhancements if the pattern is present, we have to ask whether it's feasible or not. So it's a theory of essential properties. Because the transhumanists are the ones who are suggesting that we enhance in these radical ways. So what I want to suggest now is that patternism, the transhumanist route to surviving these radical enhancements, or at least many transhumanists, those who endorse patternism, that route is actually deeply flawed. Okay? So here I want to introduce some classic problems. And how many people here are familiar with the work of Derek Parfit? Okay, that's good to know. And how much time do I have?
15 minutes.
Okay, perfect. All right, I could do this. Let me just consume caffeine. I need a brain chip instead of coffee, obviously. I'm completely addicted. All right, so there's a class of problems that arise for this kind of view. So if you survive in virtue of, there being some sort of pattern that is instantiated, that involves, psychological continuity in the way that I sketched, right? Then suppose that you go to upload the brain, all right? So you walk into some brain uploading center and you decide that you're going to have all of your mental processes accurately and precisely uploaded to a computer, and then it's going to be downloaded into a robot body, or say even a human body that's been like grown or something from your genes. Suppose you have no choice but to do this because you're dying or something. So I'm taking this case from Robert Sawyer's novel Mind Scan, by the way. He's a science fiction writer and a buddy of mine. So in the novel, what happens is the fellow goes to upload, and he's got a brain tumor. He knows he's going to die. He has no choice. He pays his money. He signs his rights away to the next, to the uploaded creature. And then he wakes up from the procedure, and he's like, oh, shit. I'm still on the table. What happened? I didn't upload. And then they downloaded, all of his information into a different body, and that creature's asserting that it's him. And numerous legal and ethical problems abound. This is what is called non-destructive uploading. So this is a form of, I could tell you about the science of uploading, but we only have 15 minutes. They've uploaded a worm, okay? So it's early stuff. But, early attempts at uploading are destructive. They slice and dice the brain up and measure the neural connections and so on. And you can actually go to Oxford University's Future of Humanity Institute and download a manual on uploading the brain. They work on these issues over there. But in any case, the problem here is that the fellow thought he was uploading, and the uploading process was non-destructive, and he woke up on the table. And that seems to me to be exactly what would happen, right? There's no reason to believe that your consciousness would really transfer to a different body. It would be still there, right, if the uploading wasn't destructive. So this is somewhat like kind of cases you'd see in Parfit's Reasons and Persons. And it raises what are called reduplication problems with patternism. The pattern can't be sufficient for the survival of the person because you can duplicate that pattern over and over again. I mean, imagine that fellow on the table, instead of just uploading and downloading once, it could have been the case that there were hundreds of robots created with his informational pattern. You are not a program. You're that particular instantiation of a program at best. So your pattern is not sufficient for survival. So there's a problem already emerging with Kurzweil's patternist view. That means that merging with AI, insofar as it merely leads to the survival of the pattern, may not be a means for you to survive. It may lead to the creation, ultimately, of something that is your digital copy and not you. So uploading and radical enhancement, for all we know, could be a technophile's route to suicide, not immortality. Now here, in the personal identity literature, these issues are quite familiar. And additional ingredients can be proposed to patternism to try to improve them so that what you get is a complete theory of the person's nature. But the most feasible step here is to suggest that you are not just a pattern, but you are confined by the sort of worm you carve out through space-time. So you're here now, later you leave the talk, later you take the train home, say. In all these cases, you're carving out a sort of spatial configuration over time, right? And this configuration is sort of worm shape if you map it out in a space-time diagram. That's why it's called a worm. Well, if you upload or if you transfer your mental processes gradually to the cloud, it's not at all clear that you would be making that kind of path through space-time, right? So think about uploading. There you are, you're on the table. Somebody measures features of your brain and puts it into the form of a program and downloads these features into numerous AI creatures. That violates the space-time worm suggestion, and so that wouldn't be a means to survive uploading. So if we improve on patternism by adding the most popular, or I think the most feasible suggestion, it's not compatible with uploading. Now, the question, though, is whether it would be compatible with other ways of merging with AI. So suppose, as you to go back to the original thought experiment, you slowly add different neural circuits so that you're not outright uploading, but what you're doing is you're slowly merging with artificial intelligence. That's the fusion optimist reply. But I think that there are problems with it. So what I'm going to do now in the remaining time is show that there's still problems with that too. Okay, so I just ruled out uploading. Now I'm going to try to rule out other forms of enhancements, namely ones where you walk into some brain enhancement center and come out with middle range enhancements, like say you decide to enhance your working memory or add a mobile internet connection to the retina, remove some memories that have been bothering you, and so on. The path through these middle range enhancements is unclear. That is to say, it's not clear if the pattern would truly survive. Maybe deleting a few bad chess playing habits is kosher. Maybe it would still be you. There would still be sufficient psychological continuity. But what about more serious mind sculpting endeavors, like an enhancement bundle? Say you walk in and you decide on enhancement A, B, and C. I have this thought experiment at the beginning of my book. or even adding a single cognitive capacity, like raising your IQ by 10 IQ points. So the path to superintelligence, because remember, in the thought experiment, you were gradually enhancing until at the end of the day, you became superintelligent. Well, it may very well be at the end of a gradual path through a series of these smaller kinds of enhancements. But the question is this even kosher according to patternism? Where do we draw the line? What enhancements are compatible with the survival of one's pattern, and what ones are not? What is needed is a clear conception of what a pattern is. What changes in a pattern are acceptable and why? The worry here is that determining a boundary point threatens to be an arbitrary exercise in which once a boundary is selected, an example is provided, suggesting the boundary should be pushed outward ad nauseum. If you appreciate this point too long, it could actually lead you to throw out the notion of a self entirely. And that may be something that you ultimately find attractive. But my point here is the idea that you should merge with AI, it relies covertly on theories of personal identity, because you have to ask whether you would even survive merging with AI. And in order to answer that, a major issue here isn't just the technological feasibility of the enhancements, it's what is the self, and can I be confident in any theory of the self? Is there a self? And if there is a self, would I survive those enhancements? And it turns out that even patternism, which is the leading theory of the nature of the self according to the transhumanists, is not clearly compatible with the kind of enhancements that the transhumanist advocates. Okay? So buyer beware. I actually think, I'm married to an FDA regulatory attorney, and I think as neuroprosthetics are developed, consumer education would be key. And one of the things that consumers would have to be educated about, it may sound funny, it's the classic theories of personal identity. Because they need to appreciate how controversial and vexing these issues are. You see? So I think I need to wind up. Really, I didn't get to some of the other counterexamples for the modified patternist position. You have to read the book. It's in this book called Future Minds. But I just wanted to show you that these issues are incredibly difficult and nuanced. And that even though as a technophile myself, I can be very excited by this talk of merging with machines and brain chips, and especially I love the idea of longevity, radical longevity. You know, I take some of those crazy supplements myself. So that's all real exciting. But if we think that merging with AI is going to get us there, we'd better think hard about the nature of the self. It's not something we can just blow off, you see? And in the media, what you see a lot is the assumption that if the technology works, if we really could develop brain chips and get them connected up to the human brain and get them operating, then we could survive. But it's not so simple. This is a question about the scope and limits of AI technology. And as I've been suggesting for years, there's limits to what science can achieve. And these limits press up against the boundary of vexing issues in philosophy. Thank you.
So, questions?
It was such an interesting and provocative talk in so many ways. I'm tempted to pull a Jim Acosta and not ever give him the microphone back if he wants to. But I'll try and restrict myself.
The AI video is showing you hitting my hand.
It's hitting your hand. You'll have to Photoshop it to get me in trouble. just on the personal identity thing, it seems to me that to a certain extent, the issues you raise buy into some sort of essentialist view of personal identity, in that there is some right answer, that there is such a thing as a you, or there isn't. Maybe the right answer is there is no self. But if there is a self, it's a particular sort of thing, whether it's a pattern or whatever metaphysics you give it, and that there's a right answer to that. So it's possible for you to you'll either survive with certain things happen, or you won't survive. Strikes me that a self may be kind of a family resemblance thing that's changed over time, the concept of the self, and that might affect things. But a more particular, one view of the self you didn't raise, that the self is not an individual thing, but a social phenomena, and that whatever happens to a physical body or a particular brain, whether a self survives or not, may depend on social interactions, which will have a society evolving too, and therefore, insofar as this is a useful concept to identify individuals for legal or social purposes, right, and that this ends up, of course, having a lot to do with the psychology that creates, a sense of their own self.
Yeah.
And so I wonder how those sort of considerations might fit into your thinking about this issue.
Great. So I don't assume essentialism. I entertain several essentialist views, but one view which I'm quite sympathetic with is the no-self view, right? Okay, but conventionalism is sort of a name that people put on the view that says that the self's nature is a matter of social conventions. And although I do think that there's all kinds of intriguing issues about the way we view selves, I think it would be a mistake to think that the metaphysical nature of the self is determined by conventions. I mean, what if a society's conventions are just outright wrong, right? I mean, we certainly want to think that conventions themselves don't dictate what a self is. I mean, what if in the case, to go back to the Robert Sawyer case, society said that the uploaded individual was definitely Sawyer, right, and that the original wasn't? It would be an injustice, and that's how it plays out in the book, actually. So I'm skeptical of the idea of a convention, or any convention, dictating who the self is.
I think of more of a social constructivist sort of view of the self rather than a straightforward conventionalism that might be determined by certain pragmatic considerations.
Well, I think that the pragmatic considerations ideally would track the self correctly. But my worry is that they might come apart.
Testing. I just wanted to ask, so it seems like this is clearly an inevitability. When do you think that there will be kind of like a mass consumption, I think is the word, of AI parts being integrated within like a human self? Like, when do you, it seems like we need to get to an ethical answer quickly rather than not, because Google and Facebook seem to be working towards this type of thing. So when do you think that, I guess my question would be, how soon do you think we need to get to an answer?
Well, I think as a society, public engagement on these issues is actually key. One of the slides I skipped was called metaphysical humility, and I think that's a stance that we need to project and encourage people to discuss these issues. So issues like, conventionalism and the no self view, all these things are discussed, and the public doesn't just say, oh gosh, I can't wait to get that enhancement. They have to think about what it means to be them. And I think we need to hit the ground running because a lot of these technologies are under development. But I also stress in the book that we don't know to what extent they'll be developed because we don't know if artificial devices will be able to underlie conscious experience. So it may be that these enhancements hit a wall when it comes to the areas of the brain that underlie conscious experience, and then we have actually an in-principle limitation to brain enhancement. Or if people ignore it, then they won't be conscious anymore, or their consciousness will diminish. It'll be like one of these philosophical thought experiments that people like David Chalmers talk about. Science fiction is becoming science fact.
Does your slideshow have a URL?
No, but this should be put up on the web. So
No,
it will,
because
in
I do
effect-
not have a photographic memory. If I did, I wouldn't need it. I
Oh,
would need a URL.
yeah. If you email me, I can send it to you.
Okay, thanks.
Would you actually have a question in addition to the URL, or do you want to think about it some more?
Well, yes, I do. Could the suppose you said that if AI couldn't be conscious, then we couldn't stay conscious while merging with it. But what if you just what if you keep your organic brain but augment it with non-conscious microchips? You could still be conscious, right?
Yeah, and so
Just if you-
I call this like a brain exoskeleton. And so suppose you're working for a company that needs you to enhance. And so you walk into work and you wear your little exoskeleton, and then you leave and you take it off. But in the talk, I stressed that I think there's still going to be limits to that, because if you have all these awesome enhancements that you put on and take off that are at the sensory periphery, so they're not really going inside the central areas of the brain that underlie consciousness, the problem's going to be bandwidth.
I see.
Yeah, because if you look at the work on working memory and attention in the brain and cognitive science, I mean, we're pathetic. I mean, like this idea that we can only entertain a maximum number of 7 variables in our heads at a given time without forgetting them. That's why phone numbers are so short. And it gets worse as you get older, right? At least it is for me. I mean, it depends on how much alcohol you drink.
Alex, we're going to move on because I want to make sure there's enough time for everybody.
Entertaining that last thought, so we are pretty bad at remembering things and whatnot, but that's actually turns out to be a good thing, right? So when you look at neuroplasticity, for example, so you have all of this rewiring of all of your neurons, you want to prevent that sort of disinhibition of thought, right? So this is what you see in savants, right? And so in savant syndrome, so you see this disinhibition. So actually we are capable of that sort of machinery, but it actually turns out that this is inhibited for good reason.
That's a fabulous point.
So I have a question about, so you mentioned the space-time worm and how a lot of these ideas aren't compatible with that. But what if we entertain Everett's many worlds interpretation and maybe look at this as some sort of space-time worm where we're actually, splitting into multiple different realities, if we're going to neglect this sort of inevitable merging at this point, we kind of have to neglect many other things also. Maybe we took antibiotics as a kid. That actually turns out to maybe have changed your entire, who you may have become, your personality, right? Through the wiping out of bacteria in your gut, and then the feedback that may receive to your brain. It turns out that children who are born sterile oftentimes will display intellectual deficits due to things like this. And I mean, we're kind of already using these devices, so if we can't remember pi off the top of our heads, we are looking at our phones to figure out the numbers of pi. I guess what I'm saying is, why would the space-time worm be a problem if we're kind of already diverging in all of these different ways based off of so many small little details in our life?
Yeah, you raised some really interesting things here. So the first one is the Everett thing, and then the second one that I want to also touch on is the savant issue. You just caused me to think of something. Okay, so the space-time worm, in no world, in the many worlds interpretation, would it be you, okay? Because it wouldn't be a worm in any of the worlds. Okay? All right. So to get to the other issue, though, the savant issue is very suggestive, actually, Because it could be that we can tweak the brain in certain ways that are biologically feasible and allow people to have radically enhanced capacities despite bandwidth by sort of disinhibiting certain areas and then losing others. But how many people are going to want to do that is the question. Because, with savants, what ends up happening is that there are crazy deficits in some areas. So I guess my question is, if you're going to enhance, will you be willing to have these deficits so that you can have the bandwidth to pay attention intensely to, say, physics or whatever it is that you need to do?
Really prejudges certain things that we need to understand these other issues.
Very good point. Okay, so I think in a way we need to separate the issues, but we also need to remember that they could be connected. I agree entirely with that. So we could separate it in the following sense. Even if these chips and AIs can be conscious, or the chips can underwrite consciousness in the brain, that is to say, it still may be that you can't survive because your pattern doesn't survive or your soul doesn't survive these radical shifts. So separating out the issues gives us a handle on some of the problems. Personally, though, I think that the problem of consciousness may have a solution which also helps with the problem of personal identity. I mean, I think it's absolutely core to the survival of the person that there be a relation of continuity of consciousness. It's not a simple issue to spell out, obviously, because you go to sleep at night, you have anesthetic. General anesthesia freaks me out. That one's just like, oh shit, I could be dead. But, I mean, if you study personal identity, you don't want to have surgery. Just saying. But, I mean, I think consciousness is probably connected to the issue. And it makes it super vexing, right? And so that's why I take the stance in my book of metaphysical humility. Look, we haven't solved these problems. We're not going to solve them before we start having brain enhancements. So the public needs to understand if they enhance, it may be to their demise. And so one way to move forward is if people look at the different theories and then they say to themselves, well, I think this one's plausible, I think this one's implausible, I think this one might be true, and then you decide to enhance based on the projections of the theories you find plausible. So what I suggest, just my generic suggestion here, is slow, biologically based enhancements are the safest ones. So if they can get nanobots in there to repair your cells, why not, right? I mean, that's not replacing any part of your brain with artificial components. But when you get into these more radical enhancements, that's where you're probably getting into risky territory. And there are theories there where we just can't make up our minds about because issues like consciousness lurk.
I think I'm asking a methodological question, but I'll try and make it a little bit more specific. You stressed a number of times that we need to get the metaphysics straight. And it strikes me that getting the metaphysics straight is basically piggybacking on getting the morality right. Right? So if you're choosing between particular views of personal identity, it's typical, very typical that the thought experiments involve, putting forward some kind of morally unpleasant outcome of this particular branch, and then you say, no, we can't go down that branch because it's morally unpleasant. So in the background, I kept asking myself, what's so big about the persistence of cells? It doesn't seem to me that metaphysics can answer that question. That seems like a moral question. What's so important about the persistence of consciousness? That's not the kind of thing that metaphysics can answer for us. That's a moral question. So if our moral intuitions are driving the metaphysics, why worry about the metaphysics? Skip it and go to the moral part.
Okay, so I was assuming that if you're enhancing, you're enhancing because you want to survive. So that's a moral decision you've made. And I'm saying you can't get there if you don't think through the metaphysics. So I think there's a delicate dance here between metaphysics and value. So I'm not telling you that you should care about your own survival. I'm saying if you do, you might want to think twice about enhancing.
You know that Nick Agger has written, I forget the name of his book, but basically he argues the same thing about the human race, that if we adopt enhancement, we won't be the human race anymore, and therefore we will have committed suicide. And I consider that argument as fallacious as an argument about personal identity for the same eliminative reasons about the categories that they're being used. You know, the human race, when you look, we never began as a human race. There's no obvious limit to when we would stop being a human race. We don't even know the limits to human race on the machine side or on the animal side. So to me, it all comes down to silly semantic arguments about angels on the heads of pins. I'm wondering, since I know you're more sympathetic with the no-self view, the eliminativist view, why don't you try to couch that for people instead of, you know, it seems like you're reifying with your talk all these fallacious anxieties that people have about, oh my God, if I cut my hair, I'm not the same person anymore, and therefore I've committed suicide.
Yeah. Well, you're much more confident in the no-self view than I am. Okay. And I also feel like if I was confident that we don't survive from minute to minute, you know, for these reasons in Derek Parfit's work or, you know, issues in Buddhist psychology, that because we can't be certain, and I can't be certain, I feel almost like an obligation to convey to people these issues, because this is about really consumer education for future individuals who have enhancements, and they need to understand if they're even, you know, if they're Christians, for instance, oh, this might involve the survival of the soul. I mean, I'm not going to push on people enhancements, right, suggesting that they can survive and they can get technological nirvana the way Kurzweil suggests, you know, if there are vexing issues here that have not been addressed. And I'm not optimistic that they'll be solved anytime soon.
Make a comment about patternism. So some of what animates this is that at least the anxiety is about personal immortality or personal survival, right? And Hume gets the bundle of perception view attributed to him, and he does talk about that. But then in the appendix to the treatise, he goes back and says, well, I thought about this again, and it's not exactly that it's a bundle of perceptions. If you can analogize the self to anything at all, it's to a republic. And the point that he makes is that if the self persists, it's the same way in which a state persists through time, that even though all of the officials are gone, they continue to relate to each other in a certain political structure that's the same through time, which makes the United States the same as it was X number of years ago, because there's still different branches and there's still a constitution and so on and so forth. So it's kind of an early version, if you want, of patternism. But it's not, see, the thing about that is that is institutional survival, it's not personal survival.
Right, it's more conventionalist.
Yeah, I mean, either that or the parts interact with each other according to a certain set of causal structures. But why would I care about that if I care about personal survival, right?
That's the patternist position, and that goes back to the famous Ship of Theseus case as well. Right. And illustrates again how difficult it is to figure these issues out.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is that almost on any understanding of patternism, there's a gap between the survival of a pattern and the survival of a consciousness.
That's really interesting. We don't, I don't think it's, if patternism's right, it's got to be together with some other thing like spatiotemporal continuity. And then the hope there would be
Right.
you could plug that gap up by fixing the theory.
Yeah.
But another idea which comes up in the context of these personal identity theories is just that there's some primitive fact of the matter in the universe about survival. I mean, that could be too, and we just haven't uncovered it. And we have an epistemic problem whenever we try to do it.
Thank you very much. It was interesting. Like I was wondering also a little bit about the pattern view, just sort of more concrete pragmatics. Like you said, they had uploaded a worm.
Yeah.
So like then the whole upload.
You can do it at home. So there's this open worm project, and so did you hear about this, Jay? Yeah. So they took a worm, and they took I think it has like 300 neurons, C. elegans, that worm, and they uploaded it, and then they downloaded it into a Lego robot. So you could do this like with your kids, and it acted like a worm. But that doesn't mean it's the same worm, right? I mean, they're copying the neural connections, and the uploading projects are surely going to get more and more sophisticated. And by the way, I'm not a complete foe of uploading. I mean, I wrote a piece on this for the New York Times, and I said there could be other reasons to upload. I mean, maybe you just want to create a duplicate of yourself. Like maybe you're dying and you want somebody to carry out your earthly projects. Or maybe we find out that we've ruined the environment, and this is sad, but we can create a species of uploads. And they'd be human-like. I mean, it goes to issues, what is it to be human? What is it to be a person? I mean, but the question here is, which I treated today, was the question of enhancement, which is the idea that it's enhancing the person who made the decision to enhance, not somebody else.
All right. Susan, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Really great.
Thanks for the great questions.